So we had what I thought was a really good conversation about 2 months ago, not like that.
Yeah.
And my sense of it at the time, to be perfectly honest, was that it was a bit above my pay grade. And so I thought the best thing to do would actually just be to record it, ask you to do more or less the same thing again. And of course, you can change it as you see fit. And then I would share it, and in hopes that people who are more able to grasp it and maybe in a position to help might see it and then would choose to do so. So I recall it, retain the right to ask questions, but more or less the floor is yours. In fact, I'll even make you the host. So if you want to do anything with that, you can do that.
Okay. Yeah, I thought a bit I could start and frame the whole thing with a map that I used last time that I find quite useful. And then I kind of thought we can just explore it in conversation. So I didn't prepare like a full presentation. I just have bits and pieces here. And when they fit, I will bring them up. That was kind of my idea.
Sounds
If
good.
you're fine with that. Yeah, so yeah, then can I share my screen to start? Yeah. Okay. Let me do that. Okay, you can see my desktop, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, so maybe to start, the whole thing, like the grammar of the whole thing is kind of written in the immanent metaphysics. And what you see on the left is kind of a notation I tend to use. I'll just explain that before I jump into the content. But what you see there is basically a representation of the three modalities, which, yeah, I will probably use here and there throughout the slides. So the wave in the middle is kind of like the immanent modality. The rectangle represents the omniscient, and the circle represents the transcendent, kind of inspired by the yin and yang symbol. And the arrow kind of points to the right relationship, like the masculine, the omniscient, in service to the feminine, the transcendent. So this is kind of, I hope it's not too confusing, but it since the whole thing is full of trinities, it kind of thought it was nice to have like this notation. Does that make sense?
Yep, I could definitely work with that.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so one trinity that I find quite useful to frame the whole thing or map the whole thing is that of the superstructure, infrastructure, social structure. Because, yeah, you can kind of divide the whole project into these three modalities. And so the superstructure of the whole thing is, like, the project is called Project Liminality, by the way. It might be useful to point that out. So the superstructure is just the concept of liminality itself, and I can unpack that. But then the infrastructure is what I call liminal space, and these two kind of opposite poles then give rise to, or let like the social structure self-organize into what I call the liminal web, which is a term I think that most people have used already in the circles that we're in. Yeah, so like these three terms all can be unpacked, but this is kind of like the map, and I could just start with unpacking the concept, how I relate to the word liminality.
Okay.
So basically, what the project kind of does is going back to kind of the indigenous perspective, which most of it I got from reading Sandfork by Tyson Kapurta, and kind of taking statements that indigenous people make like at face value, just like take it super seriously, not just metaphorically true, but literally true. And one of these statements is kind of that a story is a being. So yeah, so the story is a being, and it's a story also mediates relationship. So which is quite obviously true if you think about it. Like if you look at a tree, the story that you hold about the tree mediates the relationship you have to the tree. So if I see the tree as just a block of wood that I can harvest, by the way, I think I'll stop sharing because I'm kind of like being distracted by the slide and it's not. Oh, do you need it?
Not at all. I've got it all in my head.
Okay, nice. I can, yeah. So kind of the idea is that the story with which I hold something determines how I relate to it. And if I relate to a tree as a block of wood to harvest, then I see it as a dead entity. But if my story about the tree is that it's a living entity, that totally changes my relationship to it. So now we can kind of ask the question, what is our story about story? That is kind of like the meta move. What is our relationship to story, our story about story? And the indigenous perspective is kind of like a story as a being. What follows from that is, if it's a being, then we can have like a relationship to it that is very similar how a parent and a child have a relationship. And so what follows from that is that if a story is a being, then if I use it, it will use me. Like if we use it, it will use us. But if we serve it, it will serve us. And to kind of frame that more usefully, or like to give some content to that, using a story is something like narrative warfare. Like if I see it as a tool to manipulate the world, then I will, manipulate the story to manipulate the world. That is the birth of narrative. But then in turn, they will also use us, the stories, which is the birth of the egregore, or mind viruses and stuff like that. But if we serve the story, which I would say is liminality, that is like one definition of it. If we hold space for it, then it will serve us in the form of collective intelligence. So I think that this perspective, or this approach, is very promising to actually deliver that thing that many of us are trying to kind of tap into, which is collective intelligence. Yeah. So are there any questions so far?
No, I'm following. I mean, it's the second time I've heard it, so it's nice because there's actually certain things I think that are coming. I'm getting different points of view, and time has passed. I'm noticing, for example, an interesting relationship between the struggle I've had with the concept of ideology, as perhaps precisely being wrong relationship with story. And there's more, but I'll leave it at that. So yeah, please continue.
Okay. Yeah, so basically starting from the transcendent concept of liminality, or like the attitude towards story that I call liminality, now we can think about the next step, the infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure can kind of embody that notion of liminality, where basically, in a sense, the infrastructure of Project Liminality is that the primary user of that protocol, which is Project Liminality, is actually the story and not the person. So the users, like us, we are more like the vehicle that holds space for the actual users, which are the stories. So this is like a new kind of customer, if you want. Yeah, and so again, and I will share my screen shortly for that. Sandfork was very inspiring for that, because it helped me clarify some concepts. So what you see here on screen, first of all, the word logos is has a lot of meanings, but here I'm using it as kind of like pointing to our dynamic relationship to story. So the way we interact with them and they interact with us. And so if you go back in time, the kind of original way we did that the logos worked was that people gathered at campfires. Everybody brought like their own pieces, their own stories that they held space for. So the circle, the rectangle, symbolizing that. And then in the context of the campfire, these stories would self-organize into more coherent, higher order stories. So kind of like the idea that dialectic is not an active process. It's actually you passively hold space for these beings to do what they cannot not do if they encounter each other without resistance. And I think Tyson would call that yarning, like that don't speak unless spoken through. That is kind of like the name of the game. And then what you see down here is kind of the way of representing what he calls Sandfork, which is another modality where instead of just holding space for the story and letting it speak through you, you can also draw a symbol in the sand, which is like the primordial origin of the modality, and infuse the meaning of the story into that symbol. Yeah, so yarning and Sandfork are basically two distinct modalities, but they belong together. So taking that concept and putting different language on it, you could say that we have the monologos, which is the Sandfork, the dialogos, landing like from Viveki, and that concept, which is the yarning, like the warm context, where monologos is kind of like the cold, frozen version of the story. And if these two exist, then using the immanent metaphysics, we can see that there should be an immanent modality, which I refer to as the interlogos. And here the idea is kind of, the interlogos is kind of like the dynamic interplay of the monologos and the dialogos, how people find each other in the dialogos, mediated by which monologos they have encountered and all of that stuff. A lot of complexity there. Yeah, exactly. So this is like a very fundamental trinity on which the whole project, the infrastructure of the project is built. So let me think.
Okay. So hold on, give me a moment. So something like the monologos provides the, as you said, the omniscient, which in this case would mean something like it allows us to, it orients us towards a domain. So if we're in the context of we're all sort of attuning to a particular monologos, that provides a context, a domain, orientation that allows us to say, okay, yes, this is kind of the what that we're engaging in, which then the space of dialogos then opens up the field of play inside that domain. Something like that.
Something like that, yeah. And I would say like it's like a symbol doesn't have meaning on its own. It's kind of like the culture that infuses it into, and it's kind of like a you know, stabilizing function or something. You know, like you can cohere around that symbol means that in our context. And yeah, but how the monologos enables the dialogos, I will get to that, because there's like a quite specific way I think it should work. Yeah, exactly. So okay, so I said liminal space is kind of where this whole thing is leading to. So the monologos, the dialogos, and the interlogos are again a trinity, which you can see on the left. And since the monologos, oh yeah, one thing I like to frame it as, which is useful, is the monologos is kind of how the logos looks from the outside, and the dialogos is how it feels from the inside. So cold and warm is kind of a language that I also like to use. Yeah, but now we can ask the question, what is the right relationship between monologos and dialogos? Because if you look at the internet today, it's kind of like, it's almost pure monologos. So the monologos has kind of, instead of being in service to the dialogos, it has kind of eaten away that substrate, debasing its own substrate, because everybody is looking at screens instead of at each other's faces, and we kind of distracted away from the dialogos by the monologos, and you get like doom scrolling and all of that information overwhelm, because it's not like what we're doing right now. I cannot be overwhelmed really, because like we are both like in tune with the rhythm of the conversation. But if you just have monologos, you're totally detached from any external rhythm, and then you can just totally be overwhelmed. Yeah, and so the interlogos is basically answering the question of how should they relate, these two modalities. And just as for the superstructure, the punchline was kind of like a story as a being. For the infrastructure, for the liminal space, the idea is a story is a place, which is also an indigenous notion. In the context of the digital, we can actually do that. We can actually turn a story into a place because we have a subreddit, for example, about a story, right? So yeah, game B subreddit, if that exists, I don't know, could be, is a place, right? People can meet there. And so this is the basic notion of what the interlogos should do. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So to make that a bit more concrete, let me think how to do this. Yeah, so the words I used so far are kind of abstract, but how does that translate into an actual system, you know? So the idea is that the thing, I'll go back to thingy. The idea is that Project Liminality is basically a communication protocol that can be plugged into apps, like a module. And in this protocol, you have these nodes. You have monologos nodes, that's what I call them. And each node can kind of hold a story. So I think. So I'm thinking how to approach that because there are so many angles to get into this. I think I'll just show you how I think it can work. So sorry, I'll go back to share my screen again. What you can see here, my desktop, can be kind of reinterpreted as like a poor man's version of how the project could look like. So all these pictures that I'm like opening all the time, each of that could be a monologos node. Mm-hmm. And you basically have something you could call like a liminal wallet that kind of where you hold all the stories that you carry. In a sense, that is, I think, a quite useful framing. The project can be thought of like building a digital twin of the logos. So everything that exists in the organic context, we try to kind of mirror that into or project that into the digital plane, because obviously then we can do like interesting new things with it. So if you frame like a human as something like a storytelling monkey, like a vehicle holding space for stories, then the idea is that you can now kind of have monologos nodes that hold these stories. And your liminal wallet is basically just a digital twin of your interior, in a sense. So if I hold a story, for example, the story, what I just opened here, that is kind of a story. I can put that on what I call digital sand, in a sense. Like when we're having this conversation, I can just, instead of like in the physical world drawing something in the sand, I can just put that on the digital sand. Mm-hmm. Now the idea is, if that thing would already exist, then you would also have your own monologos nodes, and we would have a shared sand, digital sand. So I could if we have a conversation and some story comes up, I can just take that story and show it to you, put it on the digital sand, and then you would also hold that story, because that's exactly how it works in the organic domain. We're basically just trying to reconnect to how nature does it. And in a sense, redo the internet on the dialogos spaces instead of the monologos spaces, if that makes sense. So yeah, does that make sense so far?
Well, it hasn't grounded for me in the sense that I don't experience the like in myself, the experience of what it's like to be living or using an internet that is shifted through the looking glass to be grounded in dialogos instead of monologos. Right now, I get it from the point of view of concept, but I don't get it from the point of view of actually living it directly. And I remember the last time we talked, that dropped, like I felt it. So I sort of propose that we're getting close to that point. But at the level of intellect, at the level of thinking about it, it makes very good sense. And if I kind of think about the way that I would orient all these different notions that you're putting out there, it's part of the reason why we're specifically recreating this conversation, which is to say that there's a lot of very precise and important things that I think are how do you say it? Like the regalia of the story that is expressing itself through you allures my sense-making orientation. It says, that's a very important story. Pay attention to it and find ways to be of service to bringing it more fully into the world.
Yeah, then maybe I'm looking for like an anchor from which I can best explain the thing, because I'm jumping around and I'm noticing that it's a bit all over the place. But maybe that's a very good anchor then, to kind of like, how does it feel like to use that project? Because that is kind of really how I relate to it. So maybe I can start by just pointing out the frustration with the current internet, the current monologos internet, and then how I see how we could do it much better. So currently, if you go into the internet, all these stories can reach you through in a cold manner. Like you can scroll on a feed and you just get information overload. In the indigenous context, a story can always only reach you when it's brought to you by another human being. So it's always in a warm context, and you kind of you will never be overwhelmed because you can always ask, and it's kind of like every time I read like a Wikipedia article about some math concept or something, I'm basically always overwhelmed. I never had that when someone explains something to me, and he takes the time to do it and everything like that. So now the question is, how do you expand? How do you serve the web if you don't just do it with a normal web browser, while you do it through other people? And so basically, when we have a conversation, and you have like these nodes, which could be a YouTube video, it could be a website, it could be basically everything that you can. Sorry, there's something I didn't say yet, which is very important. Like the Sandfork modality, it starts with just drawing a symbol into the sand. But over the years, we have developed that into much more profound capacity. So it started with drawing a symbol in the sand, but then we abstracted that into symbol systems, like literacy, and then put that even further with the introduction of music and the digital, basically it all culminating in the digital. So now we have videos and video games even, and all of that stuff, but it's all the same modality. It's all monologos, because it's basically a story infused into code pattern, if you like. So and the internet is that, so now if I want to surf the internet but not use Google, what I can do is actually be like, okay, I want to have a conversation with someone, and then you could basically sorry. I'm very all over the place, because I'm noticing parts that I should have said earlier to make that whole thing more coherent.
Well, I also noticed that I'm probably not carrying my weight in this conversation. We just sort of find our way into actually doing the thing.
Yeah,
there's a little bit of that happening. Like I'm noticing there's a little bit of a like teaching, like almost a conveying, as opposed to a dialogue. So maybe just sort of dance a few things back in.
Yeah.
Like maybe settle. So then you just talk about that, the notion of the monologos, or the well, the image that came to my mind when you said surf the web, and the way that you had talked about it in framing it, I had a visual image of an ocean made entirely of skeletons, like skulls and bones, dead, right? An ocean of dead things. Or a visual image I had of walking through a forest, but everything was in fact pre-dead. And so the experience of being in relationship with world through the already dead, like the already nihil. Okay, and then the other side, like you talked about the idea of the notion that there's something intrinsic about the aliveness of the story when it's brought already. It's always already connected. It's always already in a context, not just context aware, but context productive, context contextualizing relationship. Like what's happening now?
Yeah.
And there's a way of, okay, yes, that's proper, like that's the thing we're trying to do. And part of what you've done, I would say, is you've come to a place where you've come with an image or an approach or a technology or a process, digital sand, which is actually allowing us to return, but at a new level. This, not from silicon, funny, not from silicon sand, but to silicon sand.
Yeah.
But now aware of what it is we don't want to get lost in, right? We don't want to lose ourselves in that. And so then we're at the question, right? That's the question. Like, what's that look like? What's it feel like? Almost, can we even, maybe in some sense, do it? Like you began with showing me a monologos, like you showed me an image, and then you did something like an exegesis, like you oriented me to what is happening in this symbol, what's happening in this image.
Yeah.
And then for me, what happens is okay, there's a point at which I get it. All right, there's something happening where the orientation of the construct of the image, the digital sand drawn, allows me to find in myself, let's say, the location in the transcendent that is being expressed in that form. And then we're now reasonably well situated to be in a conversation or in a dialogue around that particular location, something like that.
Yeah, if you remember, you introduced that logos kind of dynamic.
Yeah,
that language is very apt. Like it's the logo, but in the dialogos context, we can I can transmit the logos behind that logo instead of just the logo, and then you have to kind of reverse engineer it.
yes.
So that's the idea. I'm noticing now kind of like the missing part why I'm like struggling. So let me try to take it back to where I introduced the monologos, dialogos, and the interlogos. Because if you can remember last time, I mentioned that you always have a multitude of like in the indigenous context, you don't have only one campfire where people talk, but you have many of them, right? That's very important. So I'm noticing that now. And so there will always be many dialogos. And just like in the indigenous context, you always had to kind of find the place where you are needed, which campfire you want to participate in. And like organically, what you would do, you would walk around the camp and maybe listen in to, and if you notice there's an interesting conversation, then you will want to join. So kind of like the flow between these campfires, that is kind of like the question, the question that the Interlogos tries to answer. Like, how do you find the right person to talk to, the right dialogos? How does it establish itself?
Can I hold right there for a second? I don't want you to lose your thread, but I want to bring forward one of the key points that you've made, because I feel like it can get lost. But as you said, in fact, the base point, which is right relationship with narrative in service to. And so the notion of interesting conversation isn't from the point of view of, say, the egoic mind. Either I will be entertained by this conversation, or I will gain status by participating in this conversation. But the inverse, meaning I feel that there is something in the beingness of this story that it is necessary. I have a responsibility. I am holding something that is part of that story. And there's some piece of the yarn. Like, it's literally, if you think about it in a mechanical sense, like there's a crew of people who are building something, and you know, they're getting ready to actually do some piece of actually tying the yarn to make it strong enough to do the work. And you've got the actual fabric necessary for that piece. We're like, well, yeah, okay, I'm supposed to be there doing that. Like, if you think about that, like there's something that is in the process of assemblage. There's a whole bunch of narrative monkeys who are helping to assemble that thing. The thingness of the assemblage is in fact guiding the choices that allow us to know where and when we should be allocating our attention and energy. And the construct or the context supports our ability to engage in that inquiry. Like, okay, if I'm a mile away from the project, I don't notice timing to step in and help provide the winding of the weave to make the rope strong. So I need to be proximal to where it is. But if I don't actually happen to have the right material, then I'm going to drop the ball in terms of, oh, hey, did you bring oh shit, I didn't bring that kind of thing. So I think that way of thinking about it, well, first of all, I deeply agree that notion of that inversion of story has being, and that right relationship with, let's just say, being in general, and right relationship with the being of story is at the very, very bottom of the shift. And then we can begin thinking about what are the right kinds of contexts to allow us to play our proper role in that unfolding assemblage. Okay.
Yeah, it's very nice that you say that, because like walking around the campfire and then listening into what conversation you find interesting, like I think curiosity is actually not, you don't have curiosity. It's like the stories in you, they are like dying to join that. So they're like giving you signals like, please go there. So in the context of like the Danmanamba tribe, you can just walk around and listen into what conversation is interesting. But if you scale that up, it breaks down, because you don't know what's going on everywhere. So the question basically is, how do we scale that whole thing up? And
I'm gonna want to pause there too. So the psychotechnology, mechanism, the appropriate context, the enabling and disabling constraints to support the emergence and coherence of the stories, we had, which is why we're here. And then we created a trajectory by virtue of different kinds of technologies. The product or output of this interlogos produces changes in the nature of the world and the nature of what we can do. Like you say, I draw the symbol in the sand, and then somebody draws it on a clay tablet. Well, the clay tablet has a characteristic of outliving our entire group and being transmitted very much decontextualized from the moment of its creation, which causes a trajectory. And this puts us on a journey of leaving the place, asterisk, remember, we mentioned place, leaving the place whereby the context of world we were well suited to, our innate human capacity to support the coherence of stories has now been in a sort of stumbling. It's been knocked about, and it's in this bit of random walk through technologos space, right? Which is that dynamic between logos and logo. And we're now endeavoring to be aware of what might we be able to do to establish a new kind of place. Which settles again. And the narratives, the stories, can actually afford, through their natural capacities, like that notion of curiosity, all the different characteristics of how story helps orient our attention and activate our energy in service to the coherence of the logos, the embodiment of the logos in world.
It's very important that you not mentioned this technological shift and our upgrade in capacity, because one of them is locality kind of is broke down at some point through the internet. Like long distance communication is such a game changer. It's ridiculous because suddenly everybody can possibly talk to anybody, which is like the combinatorics of that is like mind-boggling compared to number tribes, So now we have like all this amazing capacity, but if we don't use it wisely, it will just destroy us, because you can think of it as a brain. You brought it up last time, and I really like the frame. Like the brain, if you remove locality constraint from the brain, and every neuron can be connected to any other neuron, if it's not done in a coherent fashion, then you just get epilepsy, right? You just get seizure. And that's kind of a bit what's happening right now with the current internet. That basically there's no intelligence really that decides who talks to whom. And basically now the idea is that if you look back to the indigenous context, it's not no one stood there and was like, oh, you talk to him, you talk to him. There was no intellectual oversight of the process. It was a self-organizing system, because what really decided who will talk to whom was the stories that they carried, decided whom they would talk to. So if you remember last time, the idea basically was, okay, we take that into the digital, into something I call like the conversation beacon, which is basically if you take a story that is inside of you and you externalize it into a Sandfork, into a monologos node, you could use these nodes and basically ask who also holds this node. Like I'm very interested in the notion of whatever, like language models or something like that. I want to talk to people who also hold that story. But since we are in the digital, this is like not constrained to the locality. And basically the idea was you could take like all kinds of sets of nodes and be like, I want to talk to the people that hold all of these nodes, and find the right partner. So there's like a notion of identity, like who you are is just determined by the stories you hold. And who you should talk to is also determined by what stories each of you hold. Now the idea is, if that tracks so far, like with the beacon, no, there's a shift in perspective you can make, which is basically.
Let me if you can hold that. Well, I think we're just going to have to rely on the dialogos to hold us both together. And I would notice that seems to have shifted, like that period of time a little while back where we're like, this isn't working. It feels like we've dropped back. We've actually dropped into a proper dialogos. Yeah. Okay. So conversation beacon, the thing that you were describing, is a big part of this journey is this very weird thing. I referred to it in different ways, through the looking glass, the Klein bottle effect, It has to do with like the transformation, which I think is actually a return or the restoration. But in many ways, everything kind of has this involution character. So conversation beacon is place on the other side of this transformation.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So that was where I wanted to end up at. So you you predicted where I was going. Basically, if you're like, okay, I want to talk to everybody who holds that node, but you're in the digital, it's the same. Basically, it's the same as saying like, I'm at this place, who also is at this place. Mm-hmm. And this is where it gets interesting, because so everybody can create new nodes just by, I don't know, like drag and drop a link into that sand, and you can make a node out of it. And every time you share that node in a conversation, it kind of spreads socially. So, and the way I like to think about it is kind of like social organisms. So once you hold a story, you're basically part of that social organism, you know? So you're part of as many social organisms as stories as you hold. And most of them will just be like one person, just you. But the more this node spreads, basically the bigger this social organism gets. If this node spreads to you, and I send out kind of a beacon, I want to talk to someone who holds that story, it's the same thing as basically saying who is also in that subreddit or something like that is attached to this node. Like that's like the toolkit of these nodes is that they hold a story, but they're also a place in the community. Mm-hmm. So we explicate that idea of it's a social organism, so we can turn that into like a reality. So yeah, does it make sense?
Yes. Well, let me tell you a story that's coming to my mind. I'm using a different metaphor at this point in my head as I'm thinking about it, which may be a mess. Right? So if it's a mess, just tell me it's a mess, and I'll press the delete button.
Yeah.
Oh, did it used to be called the backspace button? I don't know if that still exists as a thing. What I was thinking about there was something like a combination of soul-bound tokens. If you know that concept in Web3 space, NFT.
I don't.
Okay, so the first notion is that you have an identity, right? So but it's hyper abstract. It literally just represents the notion of like a singularity in the digital space. Mm-hmm. That makes sense? Like it's a thing. It is able to be distinctly disambiguated from all other kinds of things.
Yeah.
And that particular identity can have attached to it a symbolon, like an NFT, which in this case could literally actually be a monologos diagram, if we like. Yeah. That's kind of the point. Yeah. The notion of soulbound means that it is glued. It cannot be traded, right? It's not an exchangeable thing. It is attached. It becomes as they accumulate over time. If I were to come to your identity, and if you gave me permission to take a look at it, in principle, I could kind of look into your bag of monologos tokens and see, what do you have? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's one. Second was then this notion of like guild, or for example, in this conversation, you were in the process of conveying to me some set of monologos tokens that you have perhaps a particular authority or responsibility in the context of the larger field to be able to say, yes, Jordan is now holding this particular monologos token at maybe certain this level of quality. Like, okay, you're kind of a novice or an initiate in this particular piece of the story. And so there's I'm projecting an image of something like it's probably not promiscuous, like the dilution of there's a difference between truly actually well holding, having grounded and understanding us properly and alively, like being able to hold and convey it in a live fashion, and having an image or a replica, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
You're saying that the originator of that node has a different kind of node than the ones that he kind of distributes?
No, what I'm saying is that there's a difference between me kind of overhearing the sounds and repeating the sounds without actually living them. which is what happens today almost all the time.
Yeah.
Most of the time, people hear the words, they're very good at conveying those words in a sexy fashion, and they kill it, right? They actually convert logos into logos.
Yeah.
That we have that distinction, right? So I'm
As they
saying
learn in school.
there's some mechanism whereby we're actually able to kind of like do a validation, like, yes, you are holding this as logos, and it now is attached, it is now soul bound, which is actually a really nice use of that terminology. I don't think they've heard it. I find that the folks from Vitalik's universe don't actually, it's like they are such clear channels for the story that is expressing itself through them, that they can't actually explain why they use the words that they use. Like, why did they do the logism of Tao? Why did they call it a Tao? You know, not even maybe noticing the connection to Tao when they said it. Same thing here, soul bound. Yeah, soul. We're actually literally talking about that, like the ensoulment of logos and the degree to which your soul is able to actually hold and then properly support the expression. Like, you have proper responsibility for being in service to this story. Good. Right? So then if I have those two pieces, right, I have the notion of a technology that has a binding between monologos tokens and a process which is able to verify that those are in fact held in logos.
Yeah.
This technology that you're discussing, I can show up and I can essentially sort of light a beacon and invoke a place, which is a calling or an invitation to those, and effectively light a fire, like I'm seeing the Lord of the Rings scene with all the beacon fires being lit. Of, okay, all those who are holding these particular tokens, there's a calling. The story seems to be asking for a deeper yarning, and that then separately or secondarily invoke whatever kind of constructive media is appropriate for that particular gathering. So that's where I was going technically in terms of thinking about what it is you're describing.
Yeah, that goes very much in the direction that I'm also trying to convey. So the interesting thing, is there's this notion of the peer-to-peer, which is basically the dialogos, like the story is reaching you through the warm vehicle, which is monologos nodes. Like your liminal wallet only grows through the conversations you have. That's the only way, or like the ones you create yourself. But then there is this other thing that you could call broadcast, which is monologos reaching you through the cold modality. It's just there. And the project also tries to kind of find the right relationship between these two. And so if we have a conversation and we drop notes and exchange notes and kind of expand our horizon together, teach each other, then at some point you could drop a node that fits perfectly to one I hold, and they form a bigger picture. They form like there's a synthesis that is more than the sum of their parts. And if that happens, we can just like connect them together into a new node. Like they will both still exist, but there will be a new node that is kind of like the higher order truth that they both embody. And this will then actually send out something like a broadcast to all the people that hold either of these nodes. Because think about, like, there's a multitude of people holding nodes, but in another perspective, there's just a place in which people are, right? Like it's the same thing in a very little
I get it. Yeah, so the physical representation would be, we're sitting around a campfire and suddenly in our conversation, we're like we have a shared insight. And the field of shared insight would naturally be shared by everybody else who's around that campfire. Even if it's just mediated by the fact that both of us physically react in a way that indicates an insight just happened. And if you're sitting over there and you didn't get it, you're like, wait, hold on, I didn't get it. What's up? And so then the process of allowing that insight to actually disseminate through the larger group would be immediate. And you're articulating how we might go about doing that in this digital involution.
Yes, exactly. And so the kind of trippy thing is, like, I give you the node, but in a sense, I give you a place in which I am. So it's very loopy. But the cool thing that's happening is every story is a social organism that has like the number of members that as many people as hold that story. if I basically give you a social organism, or like the organizing principle of that social organism, and I like to think about it very literally, like the story of Jordan basically inspires your cells to kind of conspire into incarnating the spirit of Jordan. Okay, so there's the story in the center, and then there are like all these beings that are inspired by that story to cohere. And they don't have to manipulate anything. They're just inspired to do their part, and the story basically takes care of it. And in the end, like their dance is so much more than the sum of the parts, like one Jordan more than the sum of the parts, which is like incredible. And so now, if I have one of these social organisms, or like stories that incarnate in and as a social organism, and you have one, and it fits together into a more bigger piece, what this will then kind of be broadcasted as something like a coherence beacon, if you like we have a more coherent picture now. Everybody who holds either one of these nodes is then invited to kind of check if that is a valid synthesis. Like, do you agree? Does it feel more coherent to you? And importantly, I can always only this broadcast will go to all my friends, and then they have to be like, yeah, I accept that, and then we'll go to all their friends, and will be filtered socially.
Oh, so good. Yeah. So just the prioritizing the notion of human, like alive, real relationship.
Yes.
From a design methodology, always recognizing that as soon as you kill it, as soon as it transmits decontextualized, you've made the error. So you always have to be thinking, okay, how do we maintain the realness of that? Okay.
So in a sense, like if you get that broadcast of the coherence, if you say like it's coherent, then you will commit to it by adding it into your wallet, So you don't want to pollute your wallet. Like, you will be honest. Does it resonate? Yes. Okay, I take it, and the beacon continues. And the more it resonates, the more it will spread. But what happened now is very interesting, because in a sense, we facilitated something you could call intra-tribe coherence. Like in the interior of the tribe, there's more coherence now, because our vocabulary is more coherent. But the vocabulary itself is a tribe. So what we also did is inter-tribe coherence. The coherence between tribes was also increased. And it's the same thing. And it's basically the intra-tribe coherence is in service to the inter-tribe coherence. And that is, I think, a very interesting property of the project, because I like to think of it as you have like the finite and the infinite game. Are you familiar with that notion?
I am, yes.
Yeah. So every story, every monologos node is basically a finite game. Like, the finite game is playing within the rules, and the infinite game is playing with the rules. So every monologos node is a finite game, which in other words is a DAO. Like, I think the whole crypto space is basically just has brought new capacities to kind of enforce playing within the rules, and kind of make that more smoothly and all of that goodness. But Project Liminality, in a sense, is there's a nice way to put it. Like, the whole crypto space is kind of like a set of mathematical patterns that kind of upgrade the finite game. And Project Liminality aims to be a set of metaphysical patterns based on the formal system of the immanent metaphysics, that kind of upgrades the infinite game. Because what we're doing right now is playing the infinite game, because we are playing with the rules and not within the rules. And so what I'm really seeing this thing could become, or is basically what the blockchain did for the crypto space did for the finite game. This can do for the infinite game, and the infinite game can actually spawn new DAOs on the fly. Like, if I have an interesting idea, I turn it into a monologos node. If that really is interesting, it will spread because it resonates with people, and then it can. But it's also something like a subreddit or like a DAO. Like, people can gather there and actually organize and bring that story into the world. So what I like, what I really find inspiring to think about is like, you followed the whole GameStop Wall Street bet stuff, right? So basically what that was is kind of like a an interesting story. It started, as far as I can tell, with like the idea of you could call it a conspiracy theory. Like they're doing something over there that seems like illegitimate or something, like in the Wall Street. And but what if we just all buy that stock and hold it? You know, that's a story, and people were inspired to join that social organism that incarnates that story, right? But it was all just meme magic and kind of chaotic group dynamic. But now think about if you upgrade that thing with crypto, like with tokenomics and everything else that you can do. Like the power of that is amazing.
Yeah. So when you think about the notion of crypto, the way you're languaging it, and we say, okay, incarnate, which I like that, incarnate. Yeah, the whole point is, if you've got things like tissues, you know, if the body were forced to invent bone de facto, like de novo, every single time, right? If the human body literally was just a pile of undifferentiated stem cells, and had to figure out how to solve every single riddle that has been solved by biological evolution from you know, an amoeba to now, every single time a human being was born, it'd be really tricky. In fact, impossible, beyond comprehension. But that's not what we have to deal with. We actually have a huge toolkit encoded largely in our DNA, at least so the story has been told to me, which allows us to actually make use of a tremendous amount of embodiment material, so that we only have to select a tiny amount of specific choice as we're going through the process of incarnate. So as you say, once I've built a kind of a WYSIWYG spontaneous GameStop implementation machine in Cryptoland with all the right kinds of tools to do it, then copy paste, right? The next version of it is something like 1 million times easier, and you get that exponential growth rate of being able to become more and more capable. So yes, I think this is all right. And then I think the thing that you're specifically saying, yes, that's neat, like incredible power in the domain of the finite, and we need to bring in the infinite to make sure that that's actually being in support of the infinite. Otherwise, it creates perfect death.
Yeah, and the infinite can kind of like spawn these things dynamically. They can have like a finite goal. Like the goal is to whatever, implement that technology, bring it to production. You know, if the goal is reached, we can play a new game all the time. Like the thing, like an egregore is kind of like a finite game that has lost touch with the infinite. So it gets cancerous. It tries to become infinite, growing exponentially, because it has forgotten that it's in contact with that. And this is basically plugging all these finite games into the one infinite game that can kind of like coordinate all of them. And let me just try to make one point to bring it back, because I didn't finish the Intertribe coherence thing. So what you just said with Wall Street bets, like the GameStop stuff. Yeah, imagine one story is, here's the whatever Wall Street bets toolkit. Like after the story is over, we developed this crypto protocol or something like that, and now this can be used for things like that. You know, that is also now a DAO that is just around that kind of technology. You know, but now you have another story. There's a story, whatever, like a sense-making claim or something is happening here. So if I hold that story of the crypto technology that can make this thing more smooth, you share with me that this is happening right now, like some example, like some Wall Street bets 2.0 thing. I can be like, oh, this really fits together well. So let me like plug in that together to create a space that now holds the technology and the story about how it can be used. Everybody who holds these nodes will be like, do you want to kind of travel to that new place that we discovered in the noosphere, if you like people are becoming like more like nomadic nomads. Like you don't stay at one place all the time. but it constantly evolves. So now everybody from both these places is invited, if they like, to take in that monologos node, and travel to that new place and play that new finite game, that higher order finite game, but they keep the rest. And what this basically does is all the stories will self-organize into a syntropic flow, which I call liminal flow, which is kind of like how all these, you will constantly be invited to travel further along that kind of hierarchy of higher and higher coherence, and play more and more beautiful games, basically. And so many tribes will just fuse together, but it's all based on free will. Like only if it resonates, you do that. But the general flow of the thing will be towards higher and higher order. And yeah, so that's, I think, a quite nice property of the project.
And that's worth putting it. Okay, so what else? Is this the starting point, or is there a piece that we haven't put in yet at this moment?
Let me think. There's one piece. The kind of the liminal web, the thing that then will grow out of it. So you're familiar with the neurons that fire together, wire together, saying, right? In a sense, the liminal web is based on the generator function of what inspires together, wires together. That is kind of like how the thing kind of will self-organize. Because again, like if you hold a story that resonates, you will find the person that you need to talk to that these stories will meet each other. And yeah, there is an interface. I don't know if it will end up being that, but I can just show that quickly. So you can think about, on the left, the blue node is a monologos node, and these red nodes are dialogos nodes, which just means these are people that you can talk to. And on a technological level, they are the same, because in a sense, it doesn't really matter if the story is Game B or Jordan Hall. These are also just stories. And if I click on the story on the monologos node, I will see all the people in that place. And if I click on one of these people, I will see all the shared vocabulary that we have. And I think that's quite awesome, because and I will see all the people from my friends list in there. So I will never see like a million random usernames. That's just overwhelming. Doesn't serve anyone. And I will also never see a monologos node in that context that I don't hold myself. So if I now click, if that would be you, I would see all the nodes that we have in common. So in that sense, I can immediately see what vocabulary is available for the conversation. But I could again click on one of these nodes, and then again see who of my friends holds this node again. So this is kind of like I think a very interesting way of surfing the liminal web. You know, like it's always like the stories, people. Like it's always that.
Yeah, well, what comes to my mind immediately is that there's an implicit frontier or adjacent possible, meaning while the user interface, you won't see the people who are adjacent to these people, but the system does. And so let's say, for example, I know Peter Limburg, but you don't. So he's not in your circle. But there's something about a way of actually conveying what relationship might actually be. Like if there's 3 people in your group who know Peter Limburg, but you don't, this may be a relationship that is right, like it's ready to happen. And conversely, as you mentioned, if you and I are both holding, like let's say we're holding, vocabulary A, and I happen to actually have A prime, which is a synthesis of A with something else. You don't have the something else. Well, that creates a very obvious conversation topic. Like, hey, there's this more fundamental or more profound synthesis that has been recently discovered. I happen to have the components necessary to put it together. Maybe that's what we might want to talk about. Both of those are available. It's kind of like the static and the growth edge are both available in that way of seeing things.
Yeah. And I would add to that, like, the way you can kind of introduce people is also like the same way I have like these monologos notes about abstract stories. I also have a note about a friend, you know, and it's like, oh, you really should talk to this person. Like if I tell you some story and it inspires you, either it inspires you to share an abstract story, or it inspires you to share a person that knows more about that.
Nice. Yeah. So let me contextualize, adding some stuff in here. So what's the problematic? Or what is this in response to? And one of the ways that I've thought about this, and I'm actually also importing some of Tyson's very good language, is the shift from, let's say for the moment, the economy of quantity, or what he calls heaps, into the economy of quality, which in fact are relationships. And that's a fundamental, from my point of view, of that shift through the looking glass, through the topsy-turvy world, or the restoration back. And if I think about it from the point of view of neurology, there's a limit to the amount of intelligence that can be generated just by adding more neurons into the environment. In fact, there's actually a limit just by adding more synapses. You know, either way, no matter what you do, the sort of the unstructured heaping of raw material on top of raw material has a very distinct limit, and it's probably a pretty low number. Like the multiplicative effect is pretty low, which is why we discovered the notion of quality. Right? Okay, it's not about how many synapses you have; it's which particular neurons are connected to which other particular neurons by these synapses. And so it's the continuous curation of the qualitative relationality is the thing that causes the explosion in intelligence given a finite, bounded resource. So, for example, if you're dealing with the problem of energy, you know, up until now, the way that we've grown economy is by growing energy. There's almost a direct linear relationship. If you want to grow economy, you grow energy. If you don't grow energy, you don't grow economy. Okay, that's in fact true up until now. And we're reaching something like, is this similar? I'll propose for the moment. Is this similar to the resource constraints of if you want to grow intelligence, you just grow brain? At a certain point, you can't grow brain, for example, by limiting the size of head in birth canal. There's just a constraint where that's not the thing anymore. So what we do instead is we actually discover an entirely new approach, which is given exactly the same amount of brain, can we radically increase the amount of intelligence, which is the thing we're actually looking for, by building a learning process that increases the quality of the usage of the existing brain that's available. Pardon me. Flipping that back, perhaps this is exactly the same thing going on in the domain of energy. And I would propose that, for example, we're sort of operating at, 1% of the capacity of Homo sapiens in world using the amount of energy we're using right now. And so if we held energy constant and we simply increase the quality of the use of human capacity with that exact existing amount of energy, we have something like a 100x potential increase in what's actually happening without any increase in energy by hypothesis. So that's an example. And so the premise is the existing internet, like Facebook, right, Web 2.0, was a quantitative bounded thing, right? Metcalfe's law literally just says increase the number of nodes in the network and the value of the network goes up, which is true. To a limit. This is a new one. Sorry, what's your last name? Rugg? Rugg's law says yes, and there's something actually real about what relationships, like at a certain point, and it's not a very small point, right? When you have like, 100 people in a network, who you're actually going to be communicating with becomes radically more important than the potential number of communications you could have, right? And so that's Rugg's law. Like the work has very long ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, shifted from adding more people to the internet to radically increasing the quality of our conversations. Who are we in dialogue with, about what, and how? And that's what we're talking about. That's kind of the
exactly
the Gen X way of describing what it is you're presenting.
Yeah, it's like so I remember Tyson talking about growth versus increase, which is a way of saying that. Like we don't need to grow more, and we don't need more and more sense maker. We need like a better connection of like who talks to whom and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's like, I brought in a bunch of different examples, energy, social network, to say this is a general thing. Like we're moving from the realm of growth, of scaling, meaning just heaping more of the same on top of more, to the realm of increase, right? To the realm of qualitatively improving the geometry and the relationality of what's already there. And that's, kind of the thing. Like that's where we're at. And it's the thing that allows us to resolve so many of the questions that we're specifically struggling with, because the tool of growth, using Tyson's way of describing it, isn't the right tool. In fact, it creates the problem more than anything else. Okay.
Yeah. And also like the problems we're facing, one big one is like the multipolar trap, for example. The multipolar trap is a story. That's very important to get. Like everybody holds that story. If I don't know who the sucker is, it's me. It's a very incoherent, like it's a very toxic story, you could say. And so it's like, it's not only computation power, it's also just the coherence between the people, but the coherence between the people is the coherence of the stories that we hold. So if we try to design systems to make things more coherent without really thinking about how we can make the noosphere more coherent first, we will fail.
Yes, nice. Yeah, there's something really beautiful to be thinking about. You proposed it earlier about the notion of narrative warfare, which is at its root, your proposal, and I accept, comes from our individual relationship with story from the very get-go. Meaning, in some very specific sense, the way to properly deal with monologue is to be in service as a primary, like, okay, there's a real being here. And my relationship is a relationship of service, not a relationship of use. And this is what creates the possibility of the kind of story that is actually able to bring story in general back into proper coherence, which is to say that long journey, right? The leaving of the Garden of Eden, I suppose, the place of indigenousness where our humanness worked. And we've been on this big long journey of the brokenness, of the death of our relationship with narrative, the instrumentalization of life, and the return to a proper, right, honorable, healthy, good, vital, enduring, surviving, all the right adjectives, life. Let me say that again. I want to say that again. Let me just, because I felt like I kind of went off a little bit too far. There's two kinds of moves. One move is at the individual level, shifting your basis of relationship with story, like perfectly inverting it. Right? You are not something that uses stories. Stories are beings, and you are the vehicle of facilitating their relationships in proper service. The logos, right, for those who like that languaging. And it is in this that the greater stories that require greater coherence have the ability to become incarnate.
Yes. Yeah. And a thing I would like to add to that is like, we need to find a way to kind of find communication protocols that are proof against narrative warfare, like that are propaganda proof. And what I think will emerge if that protocol is implemented is something I call liminal space. And in that space, it's kind of like there are these physical theories, where it's like the quantum wave function comes first and then space emerges out of that. So first, who interacts with whom, in a sense, is the primary thing. And then the space-time is more like an interface to mediate who talks to whom. And liminal space, you can think of kind of like a dual space to physical space, in which the distance is not defined by physical distance, but the distance is defined by resonance. So if I resonate with a story, it's closer to where I am. And if you just accept that, there's a lot behind that, but I'm pretty convinced that this is what's happening. But if you just accept that, then propaganda becomes like pissing against the wind or something like that. Like nobody will care if you know, like create these Frankenstein's monsters, because nobody will resonate with them. You know, it's like the subreddit of GameStop was completely you know, overwhelmed by bots and all these attacks because it was out in the open, and because the people could reach it even though they had malintent. In the system, they would never obtain that node, you know, because they need to resonate with that story to be in a social circle in which people hold these nodes and then also share it with someone. Like if I feel you harmful to that cause, I will not share with you that story, so it will not even reach you. And this is very interesting because now, like, the coherence of these, like the high coherence stories, will just be distance between them and the propaganda and narrative warfare. So you don't really need to kind of manipulate more by fact checking and all of that stuff. You will just it will just be on the other side of the world for you.
So there's a lot to get that. And I'm sure that might be confusing, but let me just sort of state the end. And we'll have to, maybe at some other point, or ideally people better than me, we'll collaborate with you and simply causing that to be. But the premise is something like, you know, earlier I brought in things like, say, energy and social media. Well, okay, now we can bring in things like AI and deep fakes. And so we're in the nuclear phase of narrative war. Right. I mentioned I had an essay called "The War on Sense Making," and said it kind of looks like it's doing the same thing. Like we had a kinetic arc, and now we're doing the narrative warfare arc. And in 2015, we were somewhere around World War I, and in 2024, we're somewhere around Hiroshima. Right? So we're in the nuclear phase of narrative warfare. And if people are concerned about that, they're properly concerned, because in the environment we're currently operating, there is no defense. Like as you say, escalation. Like, well, it's funny. I'm not going to use speech to counter speech. I'm going to use manipulation to counter manipulation. Like, okay, I'm going to create a concept called misinformation, which itself becomes a misinformation vehicle, which just creates more confusion, a lack of trust, and creates decoherence in every direction. And the proposal is, no, if you do what you're talking about, and kind of build it up in this very particular fashion, that whole category of problem isn't even available as a thing to happen at all. And that's how you deal with it. And it's important. Like, it's not like, hey, wouldn't this be neat? It's the exact, like, no, look, we're very close to the point where the entire category of how we communicate at all is about to be completely evaporated all the way down to your brainstem. Like, you'll just be vibrating in an epileptic seizure as soon as you're turned on the internet. Like, we're talking that level of not functional. So building something which has the strength of principle to be completely fail-safe against that entire category intrinsically, right? Not just by sort of like, we really want to, we're going to work really hard, but no, it's the kind of thing where that just can't happen. It's intrinsically not capable, and I'll just say it very categorically, is requisite for any future for intelligence on this planet.
It's like what you refer to as like Hiroshima of narrative warfare. I call it the monologos singularity. We're reaching the point where there is not a single modality of the monologos that is trustworthy anymore. Like video, I don't know if the private sector is there yet, but public not, but the private might be there already. Like video, you can't trust it. And at some point, it's basically, you won't be able to tell if that video of, let's say, an important speech some politician gave 100 years ago is real or not. And so it totally breaks down. But what you will never lose is if someone saw it before the singularity, the memory is still there. And that is, I think, the way out of this whole crap. Like, we need we need like the memory, what happened before the singularity. And that is like the thing we can act on, you know, like there's this thing of coherence, which is like if I tell you a story and it resonates with you, you find it beautiful, that you perceive the coherence in it with not your intellect, but something else, that can work in the land where everything is full of deepfakes. I think this can still work because you can see what is kind of in contact with reality, what is beautiful. But then again, like the facts, the hard facts, like did some politician really say that or not? The only way to really be sure at some point is to ask someone who remembers some years ago. So I think that's quite vital to navigate what's coming.
No question. From my point of view, and I'm, fully skinned in the game on that. So when I say my point of view, I'm not sort of like saying, yeah, I toy with that idea. No, all chips in on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is a good place to wrap up this conversation. I'll do a kind of a hyperlink. I actually had a conversation with Kevin Iwaki at Gitcoin yesterday. In terms of the way that this space works, I'm not sure whether or not he'll publish that video before this video is published. So the temporality is maybe a little bit tricky. But if anybody happens to be watching that, this connects to that very importantly, and vice versa. So there's an interesting feedback loop there. His space is DAOs and governance, and so there's a lot of interesting overlap. But the point, right, just to reiterate, the reason why I wanted to actually go through this whole conversation again, well, let's put it two ways. One is I actually thought it was deep and profound enough that I wanted to be able to be more capable of interacting with it, and I kind of feel like I was. I felt like I got it better this time. But my sense, is that there's something super profound going on here, and this is above my pay grade. Right? This is the point where the older generation hands responsibility to the younger generation and says, "That's good. Everybody, do help this come into being. It's not mine to do. It's mine to help, but it's not mine to do. But I feel like it would be good if other people were to gather around this particular campfire and begin building coherence and incarnating it more and more fully."
Great.
All right.
And one thing I might add to that is I would really appreciate if there's, especially if there are people out there that kind of know the immanent metaphysics, to help me with that, because I am like self-taught in that, and there are a lot of trinities and ways you can put it together. Yeah, if anyone has like some expertise in that, I would really appreciate to make it more coherent and see how that fits together. But any kind of help, greatly appreciated, and thank you for doing that, what you just said.
So we'll publish this probably in the next 2 weeks is my guess, just finding where the right window is, and I will try to flag it with kind of the old fashioned versions of monologos, hashtags and whatnot, to get some degree of attention pointed at that. Nice. Very nice.
Right. Okay, thanks.